For years now, my basic position on Trump has been that he's not that unique of a figure in American politics. So he has plenty of antecedents in the history of American politics. And you can kind of go down the list. In his vulgarity and contempt for political norms, you can see Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, who went on to take on as president after Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, and who was condemned in much the same terms that Trump was condemned again for his vulgarity, condemned for his contempt for decorum, condemned for his racism, condemned for his efforts to subvert the will of Congress. A lot of continuities there. You can clearly see a lot of Andrew Johnson and Donald Trump. Many years ago, I wrote about the comparisons you could make between Donald Trump and George Wallace. George Wallace, the Alabama governor who goes on to run for president in 1964, 1968, 1972. Wallace is most famous for his Segregation Now speech that he gave in 1963 at his inaugural address as Alabama governor.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
In that speech, Wallace declares himself a great defender of segregation, of the white South, and he extends an arm out to white Americans across the country to join him in defense of what he says are their freedoms. And in his 1964 and 68 campaigns, he attempts to take that message of racial exclusion and make it a little more generic and nationalize it, and he does so to great success. You probably don't get Nixon's Southern strategy without George Wallace, and George Wallace is also sort of the consummate demagogue. And in that, you can see Donald Trump. You can see a lot of George Wallace in Donald Trump. If you go below the national level and look at all kinds of big city mayors like Daley in Chicago or Rizzo in Philadelphia, even Marion Barry in Washington, D.C., you see a lot of the big city mayor in Trump. You could even call Trump a kind of big city mayor who escaped containment, who got loose and is now terrorizing the countryside. No offense to any big city mayors who are watching this video, of course. Many antecedents. Some people look to Andrew Jackson, the other President Andrew, as a Trump antecedent. Some people look to radio demagogues like Father Coughlin as another Trump antecedent. There are a lot of these types. I would probably look to some of the Jim Crow populist senators like Theodore Bilbo or Ben Tillman as other examples of Trump-like figures in American politics. So that's been my perspective, that there are clear antecedents, that the things that produce Trump aren't foreign to the American experience, that you can see Trump-like events, Trump-like occurrences, Trump-like people throughout our history, and that even the very more contingent things that produce Trump, the pandering to racism, the obsession with voter fraud, the willingness to subvert democratic procedures, you can see again and again throughout U.S. history. And I've written about this some here and there. But for as much as I do see Trump as so much a story of continuity in American political life, there are things about him, qualities about the specific man, about the guy, that are, I have to say, unique, that you haven't really seen before. The extent of his corruption is unique. The fact that his family thus far has made billions of dollars off of his presidency. The fact that Trump directly connects his presidency to his personal gain, that's new. Trump's contempt for the Constitution, his autocratic demeanor, the extent to which it's not even clear he knows what the Constitution is and how it functions, is so extreme and egregious relative to even his worst predecessors that it's kind of a difference of kind, not really one of degree. But the thing that's prompting this video, the thing that I've noticed before, but he expressed it in such a way that made it so apparent, is how Trump, unlike really any of his predecessors, unlike even some of these antecedents, makes no pretense whatsoever about trying to represent the nation as a whole. It doesn't matter to him. He doesn't think about it. He doesn't care about it. He doesn't try whatsoever to speak for all Americans. He doesn't try to represent all Americans. He doesn't treat his political opponents as taking part in a common endeavor. I just read a speech from Woodrow Wilson in 1913 after the passage of what was called the Currency Bill. This is the bill that established the Federal Reserve. And in that speech, which he's given to the people assembled at the signing, Wilson goes on and he says something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing here, he says that by necessity, this had to be a party bill, meaning that political parties organize the government. That's how the American system works, or that's how it came to work over time. Political parties organize majorities in Congress. Political parties hold the presidency. But just because it was a party bill doesn't mean it has to be a partisan bill. It can still work to represent the interest of all Americans, and that's the goal. The goal is that despite the fact we have party government doesn't have to be partisan government. Partisan government meaning an exclusionary, no effort to really try to work for the benefit of the broad public, only for your narrow faction, only for your narrow interests that you represent. And so all presidents prior to Trump have been party men. That's just part of the game, right? They are Republicans or Democrats. They are leaders of their party. But even as they've been party men, they've at least rhetorically strived not to be partisan ones. They've recognized that part of the task of being president is attempting to represent the entire country in its whole interest, as much as it's even a possible thing. In practice, the country doesn't have a whole single interest. It has many overlapping and conflicting interests. But the job of the president is in part to try to speak to what's common among Americans and not needlessly divide them. I'm reminded here as well of Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural, which is all an attempt to try to emphasize what's common between the two at the time sections, North and South, and not focus on the divisions. And even 4 years later, when he gives his second inaugural, not long before he is assassinated, Lincoln still emphasizes the commonalities between the two sides. He still emphasizes that this is an American problem, slavery, that this war is an American issue, and not something that one can shunt off to one side or the other. All are responsible and all bear some of the pain of what is happening. Anyway, I could talk about the second inaugural forever, and maybe I will. Maybe we'll do a video on Lincoln's second inaugural address. The point I want to make is that Trump at the Charlie Kirk Memorial, which itself, I'll say, was not a party event, but a partisan one. Kirk is meaningful to a small number of very partisan Republicans, but that's an aside. At the Kirk Memorial, President Trump said something remarkable. He says that he hates his opponents.
He did not hate his opponents. He wanted the best for them. That's where I disagreed with Charlie. I hate my opponent, and I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry. I am sorry, Erica. But now Erica can talk to me and the whole group, and maybe they can convince me that that's not right, but I can't stand my opponent.
That he hates them. Unlike Kirk, he says he didn't hate them, which, if you know anything about Kirk, you might disagree with that. Unlike Kirk, he says, he hates his opponents. And who are his opponents? His opponents are Democrats, the Democratic Party. Trump sees his opponents as those who do not give him what he wants, do not automatically defer to him, who oppose him politically. And he does not see them as fellow Americans to be negotiated with, to be persuaded even. He sees them as enemies to be defeated. He hates them, and he wants them to submit. He wants to trample over them in pursuit of his own ends, which very often are not the country's ends. And this is different. This is new. This is not how presidents have talked or behaved in the past. And you might say, well, this is just a question of decorum. This is just an issue of decorum. That certainly other presidents have had this kind of attitude, and I'm sure they have. I can think of Richard Nixon probably had a good deal of this attitude. This attitude is what led to Watergate to an extent. And that is instructive because this attitude is destructive. It's not just destructive to, I think, the president themselves, to their presidency. Seeing your opponents as enemies to be defeated that you hate is a recipe for being unable to pursue your agenda because you have to work with these people. Trump is trying as much as he can to have an autocratic presidency, trying to trample over Congress, but there may come a day when Congress is controlled by these opponents, and he will have to work with them. And hating them is a big obstacle to working with them. And then that kind of hate can also lead you to counterproductive things. counterproductive actions that can damage your presidency as well. So, hatred, not all that useful. But more than how it harms a presidency, I think it does damage to the country at large. I think it harms the bonds of the country. It contributes to division. It encourages fellow partisans of the president to see people who disagree with them and the person they voted for as not Americans with a differing opinion, but enemies to be defeated, to be trampled upon. In a country with a real history of civil violence, right? A very real history of civil violence. In a country with a history of civil war, one should be very careful about this kind of rhetoric. Be very careful about this kind of language. Be very careful about the standard you set. I'm about to sound like kind of an old-fashioned conservative here, but I do think that the example the president sets matters for the culture. It matters for the country. It matters for how we relate to each other. It matters for how we think of each other as fellow Americans. Whether we see ourselves as engaged in a similar project of trying to make a more perfect union, or whether we perceive ourselves to be implacable enemies who must be defeated, who must be conquered for there to be any kind of civil peace. One way leads to a healthy politics where we disagree, but we ultimately are trying to work for the best of us all. And one way leads us to strife and destruction. And it is novel, it is new, it is remarkable, it is exceptional that the President of the United States is very clearly trying to lead us towards strife and destruction.